Somewhere in the turquoise waters of the Philippine Sea, during a joint military exercise, bringing together forces from the United States, Japan, and the Philippines, a Japanese Type 88 anti-ship missile, launched from a mobile ground platform positioned on Philippine soil, struck the hull of a decommissioned target vessel and sent it to the bottom of the ocean in a matter of minutes. The impact lasted seconds. The strategic implications of that shot will reverberate for decades, because what sank in those waters was not merely a hulk of aging steel. It was a rule that had been in force since 1945. The Type 88 is a subsonic anti-ship cruise missile with a range of approximately 180 kilometers, the equivalent of the distance between Los Angeles and San Diego, flown at sea-skimming altitude at a speed that turns interception by point defense systems into an exercise in extreme precision. Developed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and operational since the late 1980s, each unit costs a fraction of the value of any warship it is designed to destroy. Estimates place the unit cost somewhere between $1 and $2 million, less than the price of a single luxury apartment in Tokyo. And it was this weapon, relatively modest by the standards of contemporary warfare, that just rewrote one of the most enduring premises of the Pacific Security Order, that Japan does not project offensive military force beyond its own borders. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, drafted under the direct supervision of General Douglas MacArthur during the American post-war occupation, formally renounced the use of force as an instrument of international policy and prohibited the maintenance of armed forces with offensive capability. For nearly 8 decades, this clause defined not only Tokyo's defense policy, but the country's very strategic identity before the world. Japan was the economic power that had traded military strength for industrial might. It was the giant that had chosen to have no claws. And now, in the waters separating the Philippines from Taiwan, Japanese claws had just sunk a ship. The equation had changed. The paradox was twofold and interlocking, and both layers struck directly at the strategic planning tables in Beijing. In the first layer sat the immediate contradiction. The nation that constitutionally renounced war had just demonstrated an offensive capability to sink vessels from foreign territory, less than 100-200 kilometers from China's naval bases on Hainan Island, the very installations that house Jin-class nuclear submarines and the South Sea Fleet. In the second layer, and this was the one altering Beijing's calculus in a potentially irreversible way, lay a devastating strategic irony. Every aggressive move China had made in the South China Sea, every confrontation with Philippine vessels at Second Thomas Shoal, every J-16 incursion into Taiwanese airspace, every artificial island fortified with missiles and runways had functioned as political fuel for exactly the Japanese military transformation that Beijing feared most. China had constructed, gesture by gesture, provocation by provocation, the very justification Japan needed to shed its constitutional pacifism. The weapon Beijing had forged to intimidate its neighbors was, at that moment, producing the coalition encircling it. Step back and take in the full picture. In December 2022, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government approved the most radical revision of Japan's defense posture since the end of World War II. The new strategic document authorized for the first time in post-war history the acquisition of counter-strike capability, a term the Japanese Ministry of Defense chose carefully to avoid the word offensive, but whose operational meaning was unambiguous: long-range missiles capable of striking enemy bases on foreign territory. The projected budget was 43 trillion yen over 5 fiscal years, equivalent to approximately $320 billion, a figure that placed Japan on a trajectory to become the third largest military spender on the planet, behind only the United States and China. To put that number in concrete terms, Japan planned to invest more in defense over half a decade than the entire annual gross domestic product of countries like Portugal or New Zealand, developed economies with tens of millions of inhabitants. And the missile that had just sunk a ship in the Philippines was only the most visible tip of this tectonic transformation. But there was a layer we had not yet touched. And in a moment, you will understand why the true significance of this exercise lay not in the missile that struck the target, but in the missile Japan had not yet fired. The exercise in Philippine waters was not an isolated event. It was part of a trilateral cooperation architecture between Washington, Tokyo, and Manila that had accelerated dramatically since the first summit among the three leaders held in April 2024. The Philippines, an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands stretching across 1,800 kilometers on a north-south axis, positioned directly over the maritime routes connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean, had become the strategic missing link in the naval containment of China. According to consolidated estimates by international bodies, approximately $3 trillion in international trade transits the South China Sea annually, nearly one-third of all global maritime traffic, including roughly 80% of oil imports bound for China, Japan, and South Korea. Whoever controls access to these waters controls the central economic artery of the 21st century. This is not merely a question of territory on a map. It is a question of who dominates the flow of energy and goods, sustaining the economy of half the planet. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning, with the frequency the data deserved: Taiwan. Every Japanese anti-ship missile positioned in the Philippines or across Japan's southwestern islands, Miyako, Ishigaki, Amami Oshima, a chain of outposts that Tokyo had been systematically fortifying since 2023, was thickening the so-called First Island chain, the arc of territories stretching from the Japanese archipelago to Borneo that functions as a natural geographic barrier between the Chinese Navy and the open Pacific. For Taiwan, which occupies the precise central position in that chain, every reinforcement on the northern and southern flanks represented an additional layer of strategic protection that Taipei did not need to finance with its own defense budget, already stretched to its limits at approximately $19 billion annually, a fraction of what China allocates to naval modernization alone. The shield was materializing around Taiwan, without Taipei even needing to request it publicly. China's plan for isolating and eventually exerting military pressure on Taiwan had always depended on a premise that was rarely questioned in Western intelligence assessments before 2022, that regional neighbors would maintain sufficient distance to prevent any operation against Taiwan from becoming a broad regional war involving multiple simultaneous fronts. That premise was being demolished, missile by missile, exercise by exercise, treaty by treaty. The assumption was growing costlier by the day, and here was the data that conventional reporting was not displaying with the frequency it deserved. Japan was not simply firing an older generation missile in symbolic exercises, it was developing at an accelerated pace an extended range version of the Type 12, the direct and technologically superior successor to the Type 88, with a projected range of 900 to 1,500 kilometers, according to information from Japan's own Ministry of Defense. Consider what that number means in practice. 1,500 kilometers of operational reach, fired from southwestern Japan or the northern Philippines, places every Chinese naval installation in the South China Sea under direct threat, including the artificial bases constructed over contested reefs in the Spratly Islands, structures that cost China, according to estimates from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, more than $4 billion to build and equip. The estimated unit cost of each extended-range Type 12 missile falls in the range of $2 to $3 million, less than 1,000th the cost of a single Chinese Type 55 destroyer. The asymmetry had switched sides. General Yoshihide Yoshida, who served as chief of the Joint Staff of Japan's Self-Defense Forces during the critical phase of this transformation, embodied the depth of the change underway. A career officer with more than 4 decades of service and training in joint operations at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Yoshida is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the coordinate that reveals the scope of Japan's institutional transformation. When the most senior officer of the armed forces of a constitutionally pacifist country oversees the integration of offensive capabilities into a multinational coalition aimed at the Western Pacific, what is at stake is not a routine exercise. It is the redefinition of a national identity. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not Pearl Harbor, the reference any casual observer would reach for upon seeing Japan projecting military power in the Western Pacific. It is the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, the treaty that transformed Japan from an isolated regional power into a recognized pillar of the maritime security order in Asia. As with that alliance, what was happening was not simply the acquisition of new weapons. It was the formal integration of Japan into a maritime coalition explicitly designed to contain an ascending continental power threatening to rewrite the rules of access to the Pacific. In 1902, the continental power was Tsarist Russia, whose expansion into Manchuria and Korea threatened the regional balance. In 2026, it was Xi Jinping's China, whose claims over virtually the entire South China Sea challenged international law and freedom of navigation. And the most revealing parallel was this. In both cases, it was the aggressiveness of the continental power that pushed Japan into the arms of the maritime coalition, not the other way around. And here was what that layer revealed about the missile Japan had not yet fired. The extended-range Type 12, once fully operational and distributed across multiple positions along the first island chain, would not simply be an enhanced coastal defense weapon. It would be the central instrument of the concept Pentagon planners call stand-in forces. Light, dispersed units deliberately positioned within adversary range, armed with high lethality missiles, and designed to be exceedingly difficult to locate and neutralize. Each mobile Japanese missile battery concealed on a remote island would require, according to calculations published by analysts at the Hudson Institute, dozens of Chinese ballistic missiles to destroy with reasonable reliability, an exchange rate that dramatically favored the defending side and eroded the numerical advantage that the People's Liberation Army Navy had built through the commissioning of more than 350 warships over the past decade. The era of cheap, feared strikes had found a new protagonist in the Pacific. China now faced a strategic dilemma with no comfortable exit. Escalating militarily against the joint exercises risked confirming exactly the threat narrative justifying Japanese and Philippine rearmament, and potentially attracting economic sanctions that Beijing could not absorb at a moment when Chinese GDP growth had slowed to around 4% annually, its lowest level in 3 decades outside the pandemic period. Ignoring the transformation meant passively accepting the construction of a permanent missile barrier around its most critical naval routes, precisely the routes traveled by the tankers carrying the 80% of imported oil that fuels the world's second-largest economy. Applying economic pressure on Japan, with bilateral trade flows exceeding $300 billion annually, meant inflicting damage on China's own economy at a moment of internal fragility. The greatest paradox of the entire crisis resided precisely here. The strategy China had adopted to intimidate its neighbors and consolidate control over the South China Sea was exactly the strategy producing the most powerful military coalition the Asia-Pacific had seen since the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. The board had been flipped, and Russia was watching. Moscow, which had bet on a no-limit strategic partnership with Beijing, announced weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, observed the encirclement forming around its principal partner with a calculated mixture of concern and impotence. Russia cannot sustain the bleeding in Ukraine indefinitely, and the end of that period will determine the future not of one country, but of all of Europe. But the lesson the Ukrainian conflict offered China was perhaps more valuable than any discounted oil shipment. Alliances that appeared fragile and bureaucratic could, when provoked by direct aggression, crystallize into coordinated containment machines with a speed no planning document had anticipated. And in the Pacific, the crystallization had already begun. What a Japanese missile sinking a ship in Philippine waters demonstrated to the world was not technical capability. Any industrial power with Japan's sophistication can build effective anti-ship missiles. What it demonstrated was irreversible political will. The distance between possessing missiles and firing them from foreign soil in live-fire sinking exercises is not measured in kilometers. It is measured in decades of constitutional debate, in generations of post-war trauma overcome, in risk calculations that took 8 decades to mature. Japan crossed that distance, and the question now pressing on every planning table in Beijing, Taipei, Washington, and Canberra admitted no ambiguity. If Tokyo came this far in peacetime, how far would it go if China crossed the Taiwan Strait, the line that transforms containment into combat? The next chapter was already being written in the shipyards of Shanghai and the missile factories of Nagoya, and that chapter was drawing closer. If this analysis revealed a dimension the headlines were not showing, share it with those who follow the Pacific chessboard, because what happened in those waters was not the end of a story. It was the opening move of a match that will redraw the balance of power in Asia for decades to come.